Hi, so my name is Danny Cavanagh. I'm the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour, and welcome to one of our first segments of Labour Views. It's a new outreach program that we're going to do to help and educate different workers across the province about different aspects. You'll get to hear from different labour leaders across the province about some of the different issues they face as well. And I'm happy to have with me today two lawyers from Pink Larkin, Jill Houlihan and David Wallbridge, and we're going to discuss cannabis in the workplace. And this program and this segment isn't about to provide legal advice to anybody. It's for discussion purposes only, and if you have any issues or problems in your workplace, our advice is to make sure you contact your union steward, or if you need legal advice, you should get a lawyer. So this is really for discussion purposes and educational kind of part of it. So I'll ask both Jill and David to introduce themselves. And they'll give you a little bit of the background and their experience about talking on the subject.
My name is Jill Houlihan. I'm a union side labor lawyer with Pink Larkin.
And thanks, Danny. My name's Dave Wallbridge. I'm also a lawyer at Pink Larkin, and my practice is all union side labor and employment law.
Good. No, thanks, and thanks for taking the time to be here. So what we're going to do is I'll just ask a few questions of you. Maybe you can provide some answers through. I know Pink Larkin has been doing a lot of pretty extensive work with workshops and other educational components for people to learn more about cannabis. It's new. It's just been legislated not very long ago, so there's lots of issues that workers have in their workplace about cannabis and what their rights are and those kinds of things. So we want to try to establish a bit of an educational component here for people so they have a better understanding about a little bit around cannabis now. So cannabis, like I said, has been legal since October last year. So what does this really mean for workers out there in the field?
Well, Danny, what it means is that since October of last year, for adults in Nova Scotia that's 19 years or over, that possessing or consuming some small amounts of cannabis has become legal. By small amounts, it's not to exceed 30 grams. You're allowed to cultivate some small amounts on your own, not to exceed 4 plants. So that has been obviously, for not just workers, but for everybody, probably the most significant change that's happened since October.
Right. So David, what if you have more than what's allowed? What happens then?
Yeah, it's against the law, which is really important for people to understand. If you have more than 30 grams of dry cannabis, if instead of having 4 plants, you have 6 or 8 plants over the limit, that would be illegal. And it's quite a bit different than how we're used to alcohol, for example, as a controlled substance, where there aren't limits on quantity. This is still a very controlled substance, and that's why I actually prefer to describe it as partial legalization. So it's legal, but if you go outside the parameters in terms of quantity or usage, it then becomes illegal.
No, absolutely. So David, I'm a municipal worker by trade, and we know, as a federation, we represent, thousands of workers who need to drive for their job every day, whether you're a municipal worker or, in some other line of work if you drive. So how does that work? Can I use cannabis if I'm driving to make my living at work?
Well, Danny, it's as illegal to drive high as it is to drive drunk. And the criminal code and the government of Canada, through regulation, have set really low levels of THC that are allowed to be in your system if you're lawfully operating a motor vehicle. If it's 2 to 5 nanograms, you could get a summary offense ticket under the criminal code. If it's over 5 grams, you risk prosecution and a more serious charge. And so these are very low amounts. And what you have to be careful of, and this is going to be repeated, I think, throughout our conversation, is that THC can last in your system for 24 hours. If you're a regular user, it could last even longer. So you need to be very careful if you're going to drive just for in your own private life. But if you're if you're driving as part of your job, you have to be very conscious of your use of cannabis and be very careful about when you're using it and in terms of the proximity to when you might be returning to work.
All right. So Jill, maybe I'll do a couple questions for you now. So, David raised, a number of points around some stuff, but it's one thing if you have a job where you can drive at work. What about those that don't have a job? Can they still use cannabis at work if they're not, in the operation of a heavy equipment or a motor vehicle or those kinds of things?
You can't be impaired when you come to work. So if you are someone who is using cannabis, you have to be very careful that at the point where you're actually going to work, that you're no longer impaired. And right now, we don't have a clear way to test whether someone is actually impaired from cannabis. But we have some guidelines that we can look to. Health Canada says that cannabis can be expected to stay in someone's system for up to 24 hours. Now, someone might still be impaired after 24 hours. So cannabis can affect people differently. And we know that if you are someone who is a regular user of cannabis, that the THC from the cannabis can remain in the system. And so someone who is a regular user would certainly expect to have THC in their system for longer than 24 hours. And whether or not that person is impaired is a little bit difficult to say. But in terms of the advice for the individual, you need to satisfy yourself that at the point when you're coming into work, you are not impaired by cannabis.
So what does that all mean kind of at the end of the day for somebody? So everybody, like, I don't know, would cannabis affect me differently because of my weight and my size like alcohol would? Is it, alcohol, I guess to say, is some different parameters around that than maybe cannabis, because the bigger the person you are, it may take more to cause you to be impaired, that kind of stuff, right?
With alcohol, we have pretty clear guidelines. We know how alcohol reacts in the body and how it can vary between people of different size, depending on different circumstances. Cannabis does affect people differently, but what you're really looking at is frequency of use, and you're also looking at the type of cannabis. So with alcohol, we know we have certain percentages of alcohol in a product, but with cannabis, there's a lot of variation. There are different strains, different ways of using cannabis, whether you are smoking dry cannabis or whether you are using edible cannabis products or CBD oil and other derivative products. And so it's difficult to say. We don't have the same type of clear guidelines we have for alcohol. With cannabis, it can really vary based on a lot of different factors.
I see. So I think a question a lot of people would have would be around, can my employer test me for cannabis use in the workplace? So is there anything around that at this stage with the cannabis legislation?
Certainly, if you are an employee in a safety-sensitive workplace and there's a workplace accident, then you can expect to be tested for drugs, including cannabis. So as an individual, you should be careful to make sure you're not putting yourself in a position where if you are tested, you're going to have a problem. And there may or may not be an opportunity to challenge the employer's decision to test an employee. But in terms of you as an individual, you want to make sure you're in the best position you can be if you are going to be tested. And so the clear line you want to be careful of is that 2 nanograms of THC in your blood. That's what they'll be really looking for. That's the absolute minimum in terms of driving convictions and offenses if you're focused on that. But certainly if you have more than 2 nanograms of THC in your system, you're going to have a problem. Yeah,
2 nanograms doesn't sound like much, but
it's
anyway.
not much. No. It's not much.
No. So David, what if I want to use cannabis on my days off? What happens to an individual then?
Well, assuming you're an adult, you're lawfully able to use it. Again, and this is sort of a really important message that that we've learned through talking with toxicologists and through the various cases that have come up so far, is that depending on the amount that you use, so if you use just occasionally, it could last in your system for 24 hours. If you have that amount of time before you have to report to duty, you should be okay. But if you become a regular user, then that's when you have to really be cautious. And I'll just give you an example. One of the original studies that was done by toxicologists tested airline pilots. And they tested them landing an aircraft, and then they allowed them to smoke one joint. So they smoked the joint, and then they got them to run in the simulator again and try and land an aircraft, and they had problems. But those problems continued for 24 hours, and even a few days after. And what they've learned from that is that there can be a residual amount of THC that can build up in your system, especially if you use on a regular basis, that can actually leave you impaired over a longer period of time. And we know from the cases out there, you were talking to Jill about this, 2 nanograms as being the limit for driving, where you can get a ticket, 5 can get you a serious offense. There are cases out there where people have unfortunately had accidents at work or had incidents where they've been tested, and they have hundreds of nanograms in their system. So they wouldn't even be close to testing legally. And these would be people who just regularly use cannabis maybe every day or every other day. And so they may not be able to be legal to operate a motor vehicle or be in a safety sensitive position at work for days and weeks, possibly even a month, before they could, after abstaining, to be able to work. So you have to be very careful, and as you can imagine, there may be, depending on the nature of your work, there may be positions where it may just not be a good idea for you to use cannabis at all.
You know, I guess that raises another important point. So what if you're somebody that's been prescribed cannabis for medical purposes by your doctor or your nurse practitioner, or somebody for those medical reasons? What happens to individuals then in the workplace?
So if you are someone who is authorized to use medical cannabis for a disability, your employer has a duty to accommodate you to the point of undue hardship. But even if you are using medical cannabis, you are still going to be focused on the question of whether or not you are actually experiencing impairment at the point when you come into the workplace. And so if you have a medical authorization, that's where you really have the opportunity to go back to your physician, go back to your nurse practitioner, and talk about how you can expect to experience impairment, what things might be able to be done to minimize that impairment. Is there a different strain, a different form of cannabis that you could use? And talk to those healthcare providers and find out what you can expect, and hopefully they can provide some more tailored, more individualized advice for you.
No, that's good. So anyway, that's the questions that we have at this point in time. We didn't want to make, this shoot too long at this, and I know people have lots of questions about that stuff, but we want to kind of keep them short. Maybe we'll do this again. I want to thank the both of you for coming in, and Pink Larkin for allowing you the opportunity to come in and kind of work with us on this subject. And we want to, we'll do a few more of these with some other questions, because I know lots of people have lots of different questions about it, and maybe we'll even get to do a longer segment at some point in time about it, where people could ask some questions as we kind of build the part of this program that we want to build through labor views through the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor. So again, thanks for coming in, and be watching for more information about labor views and the different shows and segments that will have coming up in the future, where we're going to talk to different labor leaders and others about issues that are important to you, the workers in this province. So thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Danny.
Thank you.